Okay, I want to pray because we're going to jump into the text and then we're going to worship our way out of here through music. God, thank you. Thanks for truth, God. And we recognize that we're desperate for it, and yet it's not an easy thing, Lord. It's not easy because we're emotional people, and frankly, what's true isn't always the most pertinent thing in our lives. Maybe ought to be, but isn't. It's not easy because we live in a confusing, conflicted world, Lord, and we try to walk this tension between loving people and honoring you in what we know to be true. So as we spend the last couple weeks talking about a plurality of religions, we pray that you would be present with us, that you would aid us in thinking this stuff through, and that ultimately the way we engage in these conversations outside of here would make you smile. We love you, Jesus. It's in your name that we pray. Amen. I want to start this way. Imagine, if you will, that you're at this place, that you've arrived at this place where you are sincere in your desire to search for God. That you've arrived at this place where you've come to the conclusion that as you look out into creation, there must be something or someone else. There's a him, there's a her, there's a plurality of him and hers, but you're convinced that there's a spiritual dimension, or at least you're at this place where you want to sincerely search that out. Like, imagine, perhaps you've worked through some atheism, or maybe you're just willing to set it aside and consider other options. Maybe you're ready to move on from what we talked about last week with closed agnosticism or ignosticism, which is really indifference, and you're at this place of wanting to sincerely know, is there a God? Who is he? What is he like? What does he want from me? What does he have for me? Imagine you're at that place. Now my question to you is this: how long does it take you, assuming that you're going to handle this question honestly, that you're going to be astute, that you're going to be studious, that you're going to study this out a lot? Wow. How long does it take for you to become overwhelmed with the number of options available to you? I mean, if we're just going to take religion and be honest with it, how long does it take for you to become overwhelmed at the number of different claims there are on God? The number of different spiritualities, the number of different options available to you. I mean, assuming that you're not just going to adopt your parents' religion or your old religion or your culture's religion or the most dominant religion or any of those things, assuming that you're at this place where you really want to study it. From a very literalist student standpoint, how long before the number of options just seem to make the whole proposition impossible? There's 33,000 versions of Christianity. A rabbi who was said to be the son of David and claimed to be the son of God, who set up a messianic kingdom that was unlike anything anyone anticipated, who came to serve, not be served, and ultimately was killed by the Roman authorities because they were threatened at their misunderstanding of him, who then was raised from the dead to the shock and awe of nearly everyone who knew him personally at the time, who imparted his spirit to his people and said, okay, let me live through you. A simple rabbi who lived in a backwoods part of the country, and now there's 33,000 versions. And to make it more complex, most versions, at least many of those versions, would say that we're the right version and the other 32,999 are wrong. Case in point, how many of you got a tract on your windshield last week after 11 o'clock service? I'm so sorry. Here's the deal, you guys, is I'm pretty insecure in my ability to articulate the gospel, so every service during my part, Lenny goes out there with these cartoon tracts and he puts them on your windshield because, they better articulate what the gospel is than a real person in a real community. So that's our response to my ineptness when it comes to communicating. Seriously, though, case in point, isn't it? This is the second time in 4 weeks that we've been tracted, which I think someone needs to put a little TM by that word too. Which means that despite the fact that we talk about Christ and him crucified and a life of service every week, that some well-intentioned, I'm sure, Christ follower is convinced that though we talk about Christ and him crucified, that we're off. Case in point, isn't it? I was thinking to myself on Friday, we should put a bounty out there. And I don't mean we should hang them up there. I don't mean it like that at all. But wouldn't you love a conversation? Wouldn't you love a conversation that goes okay, talk to me. what are you thinking? We laugh. I laugh. I get frustrated and I laugh. I would love a conversation. But if you're a person who is really engaged in the God confusion, how confusing is that? 33,000 versions, Christians evangelizing Christians. I mean, I've been saved like 25 times since I lived in Helena, just based upon the number of tracts that I've received, right? Like, it's amazing. How confusing is that? And we've just talked about Christianity. You know, they say there's somewhere between 19 and 21 world religions. World religion is a form of spirituality that is present on 6 of the 7 continents. I don't know if Antarctica counts. They get their little flag in the ice. But right, like it's a spirituality that is present in 6 continents, on 6 continents. It's a spirituality that by definition, they say the other 19 are wrong. And that's just world religions. They say there's thousands, maybe tens of thousands of what you might call local religions, which are spiritualities that don't leave a very specific context, whether for sociological reasons, you can think we have some of those in our own state, or for geographic reasons, just simple seclusion and education and all those different things. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of options. I guess my point is, how long does it take before you arrive at this question? Like, okay, if there's one God, why are there so many stinking options, right? Like, if there's one God, why are there so many religions out there? Which is what I want us to try to tackle this morning. The people that I really got excited for this weekend are those of you who, quite frankly, this is where you're at. You're interested in God. You're hopeful that he exists. But you're the type of person, you have the type of brain that you're just not going to accept your coworker's faith. You're not going to accept your parents' faith. Like, you're a student. You're a very linear thinker. You're someone who loves to study stuff out. But the deal is, when you go to Barnes & Noble or you go to Hastings and you look at the religion section, like, how much time would one have to dedicate to really give them all a fair hearing? I mean, is it even possible, right? And so this morning, the resolution might be a little unsatisfying, because I'm not going to try to simplify, millions or hundreds of thousands of different spiritualities or tens of thousands, but I do think we can simplify the conversation nonetheless. And then for us Christ followers, those of you that follow Jesus, if you're like me, the question, if there's only one God, why are there so many religions? Your response over the course of your Christ-following experience has been to get busy and forget about the question, because it's an enormous question and an incredibly difficult question. And again, I guess I just hope that we can contribute to that, hopefully making you a more intelligent person to interact with on this subject, with people, who don't believe what you believe. The good news is I don't think the subject is nearly as complex as it looks. And I say that because if you boil things down, experts and people who study this stuff will tell us that really there's 4 models of spirituality prevalent on the human scene. There's pantheism, which says that God is everything, that God is the sum of everything. He's the whole, right? Like, everything is God. I brought a Lego house this weekend, which is remarkable in and of itself. I invite you to come look at it later. There's mail in the mailbox. There's a tree. There's a barbecue with a chicken leg. I mean, like, those of us that aren't 10 anymore, we were hosed. I mean, this is awesome. Coffee cups, lanterns, and check this out. It's like a dollhouse, which isn't necessarily good, but it's still cool. Pantheism says that this is God, this tree, not this Lego, this tree, this flower, Metagold, it's orange, is God, the grass is God, the matter in this stuff is God. Pantheism says that everything is God, and more than that everything makes the sum total of that's who God is. There's polytheism. Polytheism says there are many gods, that there are a variety of gods that occupy the planet. None of them, in a true polytheistic theology, none of them are supreme one over the other. There's dualism. And dualism says that there are 2 opposing forces, one good and creative, the other evil and destructive, and that they're locked in this cosmic eternal tug-of-war. That neither will ever win, that neither is supreme one over the other, that the way we explain what's on the cover of the paper every day and what's on the news is this cosmic struggle between good and evil. And then there's monotheism, which says God is supreme, that he's creative, and many versions would say that he's personal, that God is a personal God. So really, we're not talking that we have to necessarily study tens of thousands of stuff. We can look at it from a model standpoint, and even when we go from there, there's more good news, and that is that if you're just going to trust the people who study this stuff, what they'll tell you is there's two versions of these two models of spirituality that are actually quite rare, rarely held, particularly in our culture today. We start with polytheism. Again, this idea that there's many gods who occupy the planet, quite rare. The Greeks and the Romans, the Egyptians historically are great examples of a polytheistic culture. Thanks to Disney and other we're aware of that. Today, Wiccans and New Agers would really be the best examples of polytheistic belief systems. But as I'm told through study, bona fide polytheists, quite rare. You might be thinking Hindus, what about the Hindus? And I would argue, though we should probably have a conversation about it, that Hinduism is more pantheistic than it is polytheistic, because the many gods, confusing though it is for our brain, are really, again, emanations from, like they emanate from this one central, united God. Rare, though, in our culture. Rare because, first of all, polytheistic theology is incredibly impersonal. And what I mean by that is the polytheistic gods, particularly as you look at the Greeks and the Romans and their theology, the gods were a lot like people. They had a lot of the same struggles, a lot of the same conflicts, a lot of the same twistedness. The only difference was they were eternal and they were more powerful. But they were quite indifferent towards humans, which means one of the issues with polytheism is that people are looking for a God who cares. A God who wants relationship, a God who has an interest in them and who can provide vision and values to their lives. And I recognize that it's dangerous to choose our religion based on what we get from it, our spirituality. But there's also this way to think about it. You get thirsty because you have biological needs. You get hungry for those very same reasons. And some will discount the validity of spirituality saying that, well, we just want it. And okay. But that want might really speak to a real need. And I would say that one of the major reasons polytheism has fallen away is that we have this need, not us as Westerners, not us as Americans, not even us as Hellenites. We have a need for a God who gives transcendent purpose and meaning and value to our lives. An equally rare form of spirituality or model is dualism. Again, dualism is this cosmic struggle, one against the other. Important that you distinguish dualism. Although in some varieties it's present in Christianity, it's important that you distinguish it from the Bible, from God and Satan, for example. That's not dualism, because according to the Bible, God is supreme, creator. Satan is created. He's contingent, the theologians would say. The Star Wars, not dualistic. You have the Force, which is supreme and first, and the dark side is a schism from that. Now, historically, what people will tell us is dualism tends to resolve itself in one of two ways. It resolves itself via pantheism, by saying that these two forces emanate from the one, or it resolves itself via monotheism, by saying one is supreme and the other is contingent. Which this is complicated, but this is also why there's such intense conversation about Mormonism in our culture, and whether or not it's monotheistic. Because Mormonism, in their very own teaching, talks about we're all gods, or at least we all have that capacity. And so you can see why there's this conflict, because it tends to betray at the heart of what monotheism is all about. So what that really does, I know this feels like college. I'm sorry, we're going to turn a corner. What that really does is leaves us two, pantheism and monotheism. And if you haven't seen Avatar, then you should, because it's not just a remarkable movie, it's representative of a very strong movement within culture. That pantheism is happening, and it's happening rapidly. Well, we'll talk about why. Pantheism says everything is God. All of this is God. That God is the unity of all matter. Monotheism says God created everything for his glory, for his purposes, but God created everything. Pantheism says that if we get rid of this, if we do that, then God ceases to exist. that without the sum total of everything, there is no God, because that's who God is. Monotheism says that if that happens, God's existence isn't affected in one bit. Pantheism says that you and I, that we are God. Monotheism says, well, you're onto something in the fact that we are elevated within creation, that we have a higher importance within creation. It's called the divine spark, some theologians call it. It means that we're created with special opportunity and special responsibility, and that we're created for personal relationship with God, something that the other creatures aren't. But we're not God, and there's a strong distinction there. Now, to be fair to pantheism, I think there's some really good reasons why a thinking person or why thinking people are choosing and gravitating towards pantheism. To be fair, first of all, because of its message of unity. It's saying, like, wait a minute, we're all the same. And the way that you might say to your kids, knock it off, you're on the same team, you know? And the way my heart, just gets mad about the track dude. I'm assuming it's a guy, so see, my gender lack of neutrality works both ways. Dude, we're on the same team. Pantheism does a very similar thing and says, knock it off. We're all God. We all represent him, which you can see how that's a unifying force. Pantheism, Avatar is another example of all of this. If you can remember the movie, again, sorry if you haven't seen it, but the people of Avatar, they're elevated because they understand this. And the humans are degraded because of their lack of appreciation for this. I think pantheism is also highly regarded in our culture because it doesn't just say that humans are divine, it says that every drop of water is divine. And our kids, my grandkids, some of your kids, they'll be fighting world wars over water because it's a big deal. Hundreds of thousands of people die every day from a lack of water. Pantheism says, you know why? Because it's divine. Every drop of water, every rock, every fish, every animal is divine. And so in a world where neighbor fails to love neighbor, where there's so much division socioeconomically and ethnically and religiously, and even just by geography, Raiders fans and Broncos fans, where there's such a lack of diversity, pantheism comes in and says, no. We're all the same. And in a culture that is increasingly aware of the connection with people and the environment, again, pantheism has a really workable worldview. Take care of it because it's me. It's us. It's God is their message. I think also pantheism is growing, because it gives words to experiences we have. The moment that you pull the trigger on the buck, and there's that bittersweet, sense of I just killed something and that was awesome and that was all sacred. The first time you heard the heartbeat of your firstborn in utero, the first time you held a newborn, backpacking and seeing the sunrise or seeing a mountain that people don't see unless they go 10 miles in, that sense of sacredness and otherliness and just wow. Pantheism has a way of explaining that, and they say, it's because it's all divine. It's all divine. Now, the downsides, first are this, that the highest end of pantheism is that you would cease to exist. It literally becomes the goal. This is true of Buddhism, it's true of Hinduism. The goal is that you would just cease to exist, which, for better or for worse, you can see how, that's attractive to me about 3 days a week, but, right? We can joke and say that sounds good on some occasions, but the bigger problem is this, though, I think, actually. When you push diversity to that extent, here's what else you do, is you say the raped and the raper, the murdered and the murderer, the minority inflicted with injustice, and the unjust ruler, the human eyeball and a cancerous tumor, they're all the same. All of those are God. It's what you've done when you move in this direction of the unity of all things, when you get rid of diversity, similar to what we talked about with atheism, one of the things you've done is you've rid yourself of a distinction between good and bad, beautiful and ugly. Now, cancer somehow is God. And you can see how that becomes problematic from just a logical worldview standpoint. And some will try to fix pantheism by saying that we're all evolving, that it's evolving itself in a more positive direction. But an honest person will step in and go, well, wait a minute, we've just stepped beyond pantheism, we've stepped into monotheism. Like when we start talking about a good, a standard of morality and beauty and righteousness and love that's outside of the universe, we've stepped beyond pantheism, which says everything is interdependent and this is what there is. We've stepped into monotheism. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, again, to be honest, there's some good reasons that dualists and atheists and agnostics and pantheists would say, I don't know about monotheism. Namely, that as soon as you say there's one God, the next question is what? Which one? And as soon as you ask that question, you're right back at the intersection that's the result or the cause of crusades and jihads and holy wars. You're right back at the place of incredible bigotry. You're right back at the place of know-it-all and a lack of mystery. You're right back at the place of incredible injustice and overwhelming complexity. You're right back to where we started. If there's only one God, why are there so many religions? Really what you've done is you've arrived at the very place that causes us to gravitate towards pantheism and agnosticism and atheism, because the complexity of the question is, frankly, a little overwhelming. I mean, it leads to the place of, okay, so if I believe in this one God, am I going to end up on a street corner someday shouting condemnation to people who don't believe in the one God that I believe in? So monotheism, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, it has some ugly heads to it too, doesn't it? And I don't just mean like versions outside of the Bible. I mean, there's some ugly versions of monotheism. So rather than pointing a finger at ugliness, what I want to do is just continue the conversation by suggesting two good forms of monotheism. Two forms that I think compel us in a direction that we'll ultimately land with next week in our final conversation. The first is this, that good monotheism, it affirms truth wherever it's found. Now this one gets tricky, so stick with me. Pantheism says everything is God. Monotheism says, nope, not the case. Everything is created by God. Colossians, my favorite text in the whole New Testament, for by him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority, all things were created by him and for him. By the way, Paul is writing this in what? A very polytheistic culture. He's going, no. God created everything. But here's where I think there's some implications. Does everything then reflect God's glory? Isn't that what he's saying? Everything reflects who God is back to us. Not in its entirety, not with crystal clear accuracy all the time, but, N.T. Wright says it this way, that creation is full of signposts about God and his nature. Paul in Romans 1:20, I picked up the mail and now I'm distracted. Paul in Romans 1:20 says this, that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. What is he saying? That truth is accessible through creation. That creation itself gives us hints of God and his nature. With me so far? Ever had a conversation with somebody, and as best you can tell, they've never read the Bible a day in their life. They don't consider themselves a Christ follower. And you're talking about marriage, and they say something to you, and suddenly you're struck as a Christ follower. You have incredible conflict because they just said something that is remarkably true, remarkably Christ-like. I mean, you could go find the verse if you wanted to bullet point it. Ever had that happen? Never read the Bible a day in their life? Ever watched a movie that's incredibly non-Christ-centered, and yet there's this moment that the narrative shouts the gospel to you, shouts the need for grace, shouts truth to you? What is that? Well, I think Paul would say affirm truth wherever it's found. Here's my point, is people who struggle with monotheism struggle with its arrogance. Because we say that if it doesn't have a cross on the logo and they're not one of them, then nothing they say is truth. which defies the heart of biblical theology, by the way, because biblical theology talks about something called common grace. We won't get into that. I would say Jesus says, hey, follow the truth. You're going to find me. Pursue the truth, and you're going to find me. Monotheism often starts with an argument, a disagreement. I just wonder if maybe good monotheism doesn't start by recognizing and listening and paying attention to where people have caught glimpses of truth. I'm not suggesting that the Bible is not the standard, of course. I believe that as a Christ follower, that if it contradicts the text, then I'm out. But I feel like some of the biggest mistakes I made as a young Christ follower, and I'm sure that some of you can relate to this, was my arrogance that someone who didn't follow Jesus couldn't possibly know one iota of truth. The Bible doesn't force us to live that way. We get to have conversation and listen. Rob Bell, he says it this way, that Christian, it makes a great noun, and it makes a terrible adjective. That when someone says, I'm a Christ follower, saved by his grace, living my life surrendered in his name, that is beautiful. But when someone says that's a Christian gym, or a Christian book, or a Christian album, or a Christian business, it's disturbing. Because there's two really bad implications of that statement. One is that because it's a Christian book, everything in it's true. Yikes. Right? The other is because it's not a Christian book, nothing in it is true. Which I'm going to say betrays what the text tells us about God's common grace and his presence throughout. I know it's uncomfortable for some of us, but I think good monotheism starts with a conversation. The other thing, and maybe even bigger than that, is I think good monotheism affirms God's desire to be connected to creation. And here's what I mean by this. The term religion, and it's a term I know a lot of us who follow Jesus kind of push back on, and for good reason sometimes, but the term religion, its roots are re, which means again, and lig, which means ligament. Religion in its historical beginnings meant to reconnect. That monotheism, good monotheism, recognizes that people were made to be connected with God and connected to creation. That God created us with the capacity to disconnect. Like your kids, they have the option, maybe not today, but someday, to disconnect from you. That God created us with that very same option. And it's not just an option, it's someone that every one of us has cashed in. We've taken it to the bank. We've seized that opportunity. It's why the paper doesn't have to work very hard for something to write. It's what we might call depravity. Everybody cashed in on it. And that's not just a spiritual thing. This is right at the heart of why everything is spiritual, because that also became intensely relational. Consider the opening moments of the book of Genesis. God creates Adam and Eve. They are made for this purpose to join him and sticking their hands in the soil and moving things forward. There's this fall, there's the snake and the apple deal. We don't really know that it was either one of those, but we all know that it was both of those, right? First thing that happens after they eat the fruit is what? Fig leaves. What's going on there? Well, Jewish theologians will tell us that the first thing that sin affected was Adam and Eve's vulnerability one to the other. The very first thing going on there was insecurity. Right? Like last service, there were like 20 people in the room. This is exact. Where's the fig leaves? Like I was looking for some, right? The capacity that I'm not, or the threat, the fear that I'm not good enough, the threat, the fear that if she knows that, she won't love me. That's what the fig leaves are about. We're talking about sin, and the first thing that the Bible portrays it affecting are their relationship. Then what happens? They try to hide from God, which I've done a lot of illogical things in my life, but I think that would rank higher than anything I've done, hiding from God. Like, hey, those kids, where are you going? Always running off. Like, you can't hide from God. What is that? Disconnect. Not long after that, one kid, one of their offspring, I always get them confused, so I'm just going to pretend like I know, but now I just blew it. One of their offspring kills the other. Who killed who? Cain killed Abel. I don't know why I can't get that. It's like this hiccup. What is that? Relational disconnect. That good monotheism says we were made to be connected with God, and we opted out, affecting ourselves, and not just ourselves and God, but ourselves and everyone. which creates a dilemma for God. Option A is he just stands back. And the Bible demonstrates him contemplating that option. Just stands back, won't even exercise common grace, and just let the thing spiral. He talks about regretting that he even made them. Option B is he intervenes. But then the question becomes, well, how do you intervene without betraying the whole operation? I mean, the whole thing was about love and beauty that comes as a result of freedom and choice. Now you're going to intervene and manipulate that, so now it's puppets, robots, and rats. So good monotheism then resolves itself. I know I'm working very linearly right now. Monotheism then resolves itself in three ways. I forgot the word. What is it? Oh yeah, determinism. There's determinism. There's determinism present in many different versions of monotheism. Determinism says, God went, I got to do something. The only hope they have is if I do something. And so he steps in and he saves some, he reconnects some, and not others. And then you say, well, how and who? Like, why them? And the most honest answer of a determinist is, don't know. Don't know. God arbitrarily saves some and not others. Option B, that some monotheism uses to resolve itself, is universalism. They read verses and hear narratives like John 3:16 that says, God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever believes shall not perish but have eternal life. And what they understand going on there is that God sent his son, who lived a sinless life and paid the ultimate sacrifice and was resurrected, and now all are forgiven. Universalism recognizes the tension, recognizes the dilemma, and solves it by saying God is a God of grace and he just saves everybody. Now, if I had my pick, that would be the one I would want, wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be nice? You know, they say that one of the greatest threats to 20 and 30-something evangelicalism today is Christian universalism. I would suggest to you that God resolves the tension with option C, and it's called redemption. It's very similar to universalism, except for it involves personal responsibility. That option C of good monotheism affirms God's desire to be connected with creation. It affirms by saying, yeah, people were made to be connected with me, and they were made to connect creation to me. But they have to acknowledge it. They have to trust. They have to lean into Jesus. Option C says God sent his son. And it's in belief, which is a word that gives us all hives. Because either it's not strong enough for us or it's too strong for us, right? Like this is where we get ourselves all mixed up. It just means like I'm leaning into Jesus and trusting him. Redemption says people, like they forgot what it meant to even be human. You know when you go away for a weekend and you come home and you're like, what is that smell? Know that? Like the perspective of being away, that's what happened to the human experience. So broken were we. We're like, we don't even know what it means to be human. And the reason we're so passionate around here of holding on to Jesus' life, not just his death, is that in his life, he came to restore full humanity, to teach us what it means to be human. Our relationship around here is the Grand Street going, hey, we've been here for decades. We don't see the dust. Tell us. We can't smell the urine. Tell us. Like, help us see the perspective. That's what Jesus' life did. I would say good monotheism resolves itself, according to Jesus, through redemption.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard, and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Now I rejoice in what was suffered for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions, for the sake of his body, which is the church.